Welcome to Religion Unveiled. Today we're diving deep into the fascinating story of a unique early Christian group. The Ebionites, a Jewish Christian sect emerging in the late 1st or early 2nd century CE, had an ideology that literally centered on poverty, not just as a condition, but as a spiritual ideal modeled directly after Jesus.
Absolutely, and it's really captivating to think about how they embrace poverty as a way to reflect true discipleship, not just as a socioeconomic circumstance.
Right. It's like they weren't just about being poor in material terms. They saw poverty as a way of life, a kind of complete commitment to the teachings of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of chasing wealth or power, their focus was on humility and strict adherence to Jewish traditions.
And speaking of traditions, isn't it interesting how they kept kosher, celebrated Jewish holidays, and even used a version of the Gospel of Matthew, likely in Hebrew or Aramaic? It shows how deeply intertwined their identity was with their Jewish heritage.
Absolutely. They maintained a liturgical and cultural continuity that set them apart from what became, mainstream Christianity. They really stuck to a version of Jesus' message as a Jewish apocalyptic prophet, emphasizing that he was fully human. It was a stark contrast to later theological developments.
Right, because later on the notion of divinity and preexistence kicks in, thinking of ideas like the virgin birth and the whole doctrine of the Trinity. The Ebionites, however, completely rejected those ideas, correct?
Exactly. They believed Jesus was adopted by God at his baptism rather than being divine by nature. It's a very humanistic approach. They saw him as the Jewish Messiah, chosen because of his righteousness, not because he was somehow pre-existent or divine.
And that perspective really sets up an interesting contrast with figures like Paul of Tarsus, doesn't it? The Ebionites were thrown into direct opposition with Pauline Christianity.
For sure. They were quite relentless in their rejection of Paul. They viewed him not only as a heretic, but even went as far as saying he was a Gentile who converted just to undermine Jewish law from the inside. This view essentially cast Paul as an impostor who distorted what they saw as the original message.
That's a really provocative stance. It's almost as if early Christianity had two distinct currents, one that stayed true to its Jewish roots under leaders like James, and another that expanded into a more universal and theological framework with Paul at the helm.
Exactly. And it's important to note that scholars like James Tabor even argue that the Ebionites represent remnants of the original Jerusalem church, the group that might have been much closer to how Jesus and his immediate followers understood his message.
Yeah.
They challenged the conventional narrative that modern Christianity started this way.
It's almost like the Ebionites are that forgotten branch of history that forces us to question, what if the original Christianity was entirely different from what became mainstream?
You got it. They were steadfast in their belief that Jesus was not divine, but a prophet and teacher whose mission was to live out the law. Their emphasis on observance and obedience created a form of discipleship that was, in many ways, purer and even more radical than later doctrines.
Mm-hmm. It's quite fascinating how they held on to these strict Jewish practices. Do you reckon that contributed to why they eventually faded into obscurity?
Well, that's one perspective. On one hand, their deep-rooted adherence to the Torah and traditional practices meant they were very authentic to their origins. But on the other hand, this rigidity may have limited their appeal outside of the Jewish community. As Pauline Christianity spread, embracing Gentile audiences and universal salvation, the Ebionite narrative was, unfortunately, marginalized and even labeled as heretical by the rising orthodoxy.
It's like they were caught in a perfect storm, preserving what they saw as the true message, yet almost becoming a closed chapter when the broader religious landscape moved on.
Exactly. And their story is further complicated by the fact that much of what we know about them comes from critics like Epiphanius, a 4th century heresiologist. His accounts, although aiming to discredit them, provide valuable glimpses into their beliefs and practices. It's a bit ironic that we know so much about them through hostile sources.
Right. It just goes to show that history is sometimes pieced together from voices that were intent on discrediting or sidelining these groups.
And that brings us to a real point of reflection. What does it mean for a tradition to be authentic? Is being closer to the original always inherently better, or does evolution in doctrine have its own merits? The Ebionites encourage us to look at these questions critically.
Well said. But I do have a little counterpoint here. Some might say that by rejecting Paul's transformative insights, the Ebionites missed an opportunity to broaden the appeal of Christianity. Without that evolution, the religion might not have become the global force it is today.
That's a fair critique. There's definitely a trade-off. On one hand, the Ebionite approach was deeply connected to the cultural and historical context of Jesus' time. On the other, it perhaps lacked the flexible framework required for cross-cultural expansion. They were, in a sense, guardians of a very specific and original vision.
It almost seems like they represent the purity of early faith while also highlighting the challenges of maintaining that purity in a changing world, doesn't it?
Exactly. It's like comparing a vintage recipe with a modern twist. The original flavor is lost to some extent when adapted to new tastes and contexts. The Ebionites held on to that vintage recipe of belief, one that many scholars argue was the very foundation of what Jesus taught.
And yet, mainstream Christianity became defined by that modern remix, full of new ingredients like the concept of divinity, the Trinity, and the spread to Gentile communities.
Precisely. It's as if history, through power and politics, decided which voice to amplify and which to silence. The Ebionites, despite their rich legacy, were pushed to the margins.
And that marginalization leads to this really compelling question. What if the version of Christianity that ultimately took hold wasn't the one that started it all? What if the authentic, original voice of Jesus was something else entirely?
Yes, it's a tantalizing possibility. And while we might never have a complete picture, exploring the Ebionites reminds us that the conventional narrative is only one part of a much larger story. They challenge the idea that what survived was necessarily what was originally intended.
It definitely pushes us to reconsider what we think of as heritage in faith. I mean, how many times do we accept what has been canonized without questioning potential lost alternatives?
Absolutely. This perspective forces us to ask, who gets to decide what's orthodox and what happens to the voices that dissent? In the case of the Ebionites, their story serves as a reminder that sometimes the quieter voice might be closer to the original message, even if it doesn't win the popularity contest.
I love that analogy, the quiet voice that everyone later overlooks. But let's not forget that while their authenticity might be appealing, it also came with its own set of limitations in reaching a universal audience.
Right, and that's the central tension here. The Ebionites prioritized tradition, identity, and a certain ethical purity that resonated with early Jewish Christian communities. Yet, that very commitment might have prevented them from adapting as the world around them changed drastically.
So, in a way, their story is both a celebration of original conviction and a cautionary tale about rigidity in belief.
Exactly. It's like they were the guardians of an initial spark, an authentic light that eventually was overshadowed by a different, more expansive flame. Their legacy invites us to question, is what survives always what started it all?
Yeah, and it makes you wonder, if the Ebionites had managed to adapt or spread their message more widely, could history have taken a different, perhaps even more inclusive form?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The evolution of early Christianity isn't just about theological debates. It's about power, identity, and the choices communities make about what to hold on to and what to let go.
It certainly puts our modern understanding of orthodoxy into perspective. Sometimes the dominant narrative might just be the product of historical power struggles rather than pure doctrinal truth.
Precisely. And when you peel back the layers, as scholars like Tabor and Eisenman have done, you get glimpses of a Christianity that was raw, human, and deeply contextual, quite unlike the later sophisticated dogmas that evolved.
I find that really fascinating. Even if we might not adopt every element of the Ebionite view today, acknowledging their existence enriches our understanding of how diverse early Christian thought really was.
Absolutely. Their story is a powerful reminder to look beyond the surface and embrace the complexity of history. It challenges us to think critically about which voices we uplift as authentic and which ones we unfortunately silence.
Yeah, and in doing so, we not only honor the legacy of groups like the Ebionites, but also open up a space for a more nuanced conversation about faith, one that respects both tradition and the evolution of belief.
Exactly. It's a dialogue that continues to resonate today as we explore the roots of our beliefs. Thank you for this engaging exploration. It truly makes you ponder where our modern narratives come from and what might have been lost along the way.
Definitely. These kinds of discussions push us to think beyond the conventional and appreciate the diverse, even if sometimes challenging, heritage of early Christianity. Thanks for such an enlightening exchange.